this month's edition of Perspective, hosted by myself, Sapi Bachi. It's such a pleasure to have you join us today, a day after we are celebrated globally Africa Day. And my guest this evening is Dr. Eddie Mahembe, who is going to share with us and unpack for us his own manifesto on how he views Africa, what policies should be put in place to develop Africa. Good evening, Dr. Eddie, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Sapi, and it's a pleasure to also be on the show, and thank you for the opportunity.
Fantastic. I'm just going to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself. So Dr. Eddie Mahembe is a development economist, pastor, he's an entrepreneur, a socio-economic development advocate, and an education activist. He is currently a board member of the Zimbabwe Economic Society, managing editor of the Zimbabwe Journal of Economics, chairperson of the Zimbabwe United for Progress, trustee of the Zimbabwe Against COVID, and founding director and CEO of Underhill Investment Holding Groups, which has several successful businesses operating under it. Dr. Eddie holds a doctorate in development economics and a Master of Commerce in economics, both from the University of South Africa, a Bachelor of Commerce honors in economics from the University of Pretoria, Bachelor of Science honors degree in economics from the University of Zimbabwe, a certificate in banking from the Institute of Bankers of Zimbabwe, and many other diplomas and certificates in various fields. Dr. Eddie, again, a warm welcome to Closer Perspective.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
So, leading up to the conversation tonight, I saw a post that Dr. Eddie had shared on Instagram. He called it hashtag My Economic Thoughts. Call it a manifesto, if you like, is what he said. Dr. Eddie, you shared with us your thoughts and your views on certain policies and certain directions that you feel and believe Africa should take from a policy perspective. Can you just maybe tell us the main pillars of your manifesto?
Okay, thank you so much. And it's indeed, I posted that. I think in my view, I sort of see some bit of contestations between the older generation, possibly those who went to war, and then the current generation, maybe the youth. And the contestation, in my view, is where the youth don't seem to be happy. They are not happy. They're not happy because they don't have jobs. They're not happy because they are poor. They're not happy because they don't see opportunities. And then when they sort of voice their opinions, I seem to see a fight back from the older generation says, but you should be happy. We gave you independence. We gave you freedom. So I see that contestation a lot where people even begin, like here in South Africa, people begin to say, what was the role for independence there? Why did you have independence when I can't even have a job, a decent job? Why independence when I can't even send my children to school? So that is the context at which I wrote my post, because I see that contestation a lot where freedom has come, but it has not brought the much needed milk and honey. And the older generation think that people should be happy, but the new generation says, but there is nothing to be happy about. So that's the context. So in my view, there has to be a relook at how democracy and development are looked at. And I thought maybe there is a need to move towards inclusive development, inclusive growth, or a pro-poor kind of policies. And I think I will go into detail each and every pillar, but I just wanted to explain the background at which I thought up through it because of these kind of contestation. I think for those who are following South Africa, you might find there's social unrest. People are banning, even destroying roads, infrastructure. So all those kind of discussions, when you go deeper, why? you might find that these are the issues to do. Say we are free, but what has freedom brought to us?
Thank you, Dr. Eddie. So definitely there seems to be some tension between the older generation and the younger generation. And the older generation, right, like you rightly said, say, we have brought you freedom. And we are saying, well, what has that freedom brought us? If we look generally across the continent, a lot of African democracies or post-independence led governments are actually quite young. So is it a case that you get a lot of African youths looking outside our borders and seeing the West and seeing how developed they are? When in fact, when you look at how old they are from an independence perspective, their democracies are way older and have had time to go through mistakes and learning, etc. Do you think there's a crisis of expectation with us young people on the continent?
I wouldn't call it a crisis of expectation. I would say even when the war of liberation was being fought, those are the expectations which were sold. So when people went to war, they were saying the colonialists are marginalizing us. And we need a share in the resources of the nation. We need one man, one vote. We need to be also I mean, like they use the term milk and honey. We also need land. We also need access to opportunities. So that's how the African nation was built. It was built on expectation. And then independence came, and those experiences seems to be like a pipe dream. That's one. But also, yes, what we have mentioned is also very important because of social media, it's easier for people to see what is happening in other countries. Access to water is one of them. Issues to do with the access to basic services like your water, your sanitation, and so forth. They see it, it's now easier because of social media. So when you see that, you say, but why can't we do the same? And so that becomes also an issue. But also the other issue is not necessarily ideological. It's actually where somebody will say, but when we grew up, things were better. It seems the more we grow, the more things get worse. So it's not really like people are seeing America per se. They are seeing their own country deteriorating in some instances. And they're saying, so if we continue on this path, where are we going? And I think as young people, it's a really important discussion to have, to begin to open your eyes to say, if we continue on this path, are we really going to development? Are we really going to freedom as was postulated at liberation?
Okay, all right, that's fine. So it's really a comparing of the way things were and how we're not seeing what was sold to us when democracy was being sold. So in your manifesto, you talk about three things. You talk about inclusive growth, inclusive development, and pro-poor policies. So before we start unpacking that, what is a development economist? Is it different? Because I mean, for us, we look at economics as demand and supply, but you specifically talk about development economics. So what is that? And you specifically being a development advocate. So can you just maybe give us a definition of that?
Okay, thank you. There are definitely a number of branches of economics. So you find some who focus on microeconomics. In other words, how markets work. So that they'll become microeconomists. Then the other ones who focus on how growth and other inflation work. So they will focus on macroeconomics. Others will focus on the economics of international trade and so forth. So there are several branches. So what I focused on myself was to look at both macroeconomics, but also international development issues. To give an example, I would look at why nations fail and others do well, and why they persistent in poverty, why there is persistent in inequality, what causes that? Is it because of international factors, or there are local factors. So in summary, development economics will try to answer the questions: why nations develop? Why can a family come out of poverty, another family can't? How if a community can be able to develop and another community cannot do that sort. So those are the kind of questions which a development economist would do. Because at the end of the day, a development economist's interest would be to say what can be done to improve the standard of living of the people. What can be done to be able to say our generation is better than the previous generation. Yeah.
But it's progressive, it's moving forwards, it's ensuring that everybody comes along, and you can definitely see an improvement in quality of life.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I just want to acknowledge Trust, Lorraine, Suela, Tafara, and Norman, who are all joining us on Facebook. Welcome, guys. I look forward to your questions as we go through the conversation with Dr. Eddie. If there are any questions that you want to be answered, please do put them in the chat box, and we will definitely take time towards the end of the conversation to ensure that he answers those questions. So let's talk about inclusive growth. When you're talking about inclusive growth and inclusive development, what exactly were you talking about, and can you maybe unpack that for us?
Yes, I can. I think before I unpack that, there is a big term I want to unpack first, and then I go there. The big term I want to unpack is, let's put it this way. When we were fighting liberation and so forth, there were contestations around: do we go for capitalism or do we go for socialism? Some will say let's go for nationalism, and others will say let's go for neoliberalism.
Right,
And
very important.
Many of them. Okay, so I think what we see in the world now is the world has shifted a lot from the nationalism, capitalism, commandism, and so forth. In other words, those who are developing as we speak, they've shifted their discussion from there. They have now shifted their discussion to what is now called democratic developmental states. In other words, they are democratic in nature. In other words, they allow free and fair election. At the same time, they are development oriented. So in other words, their policies are meant to develop the nation. So they tend to measure their progress in saying, how many millionaires have we made? How many people are in education? And when they're in education, what kind of jobs can they do? So that's a very big shift where a government is involved in the market forces, but is involved from a developmental perspective, where you tend to guide the market through Vision 2030 or Vision 2050, but then you sort of bring in labor, you bring in capital, you bring in business together in a more, what is now called a democratic developmental state. And like I said, the reason for that is simple. It's because people want freedom and they want development, and they want both of them, not either or. So you can't say, okay, now we have development, but let's wait about freedom. Or we have freedom, but development, let's talk later. There has to be a way of balancing and delivering both. In other words, both democracy and development, both democracy and development have to be delivered as like Namanj. And I think that's where the real challenge is, where some regimes say, but at least we are building roads, or at least we are doing this. But I say, but where is our freedom? So they want both.
And you can definitely see that with the younger generation, our millennials, our alphas, our digital natives, they are definitely very outspoken. They definitely want to be heard. They definitely do not want to be spoken down at. They want to be engaged. So I can see how you're saying freedom is being demanded at the same time as development. It's not an either or, it's give us both, and we want both now.
Yes. So for me, that's where a number of even current policymakers miss it on how to balance the delivery of freedom and the delivery of democracy concurrently at the same time. And it's, the route to do so is now leading to your question of inclusive growth. By definition, inclusive growth is growth which takes into consideration other players. Not just say the economy is growing, the economy is growing, but you take into consideration other critical players. Who are these critical players? Labor, for example. So if you say the economy is growing and labor is incapacitated, it's not growth. You're actually making other people worse off in order to make another group better off. Secondly, if the economy is growing and it's not creating employment, eventually it will lead to instability. So inclusive growth is growth which creates jobs, is growth which allows those who are participators to benefit. In other words, there is also the market, they are protected from the market. So inclusive growth is, I like what the Zimbabwe Vision 2030 said about inclusive growth. Whether they're doing it or not is another story, but I like what they said. Inclusive growth, the way they define it is that no one should be left behind. And that's what Africa needs now. No one, we don't have time to leave other people behind, and then we pick them up now. When? So no one should be left behind when we are going for growth. No one should be left behind when we talk about poverty. No one should be left behind when we are talking about inequality. No one should be left behind when we are talking about service delivery. And that way, we are now more inclusive. And that's inclusive growth I'm talking about. And even when we talk of inclusive development, we also really need to talk about the empowerment of women. So we can't say, okay, let's grow the economy and then let's empower women later. Or let's do this, but the youth will take the care of the youth later. It has to be concurrently. The same way we have to say, even when we develop cities, we should at the same time develop rural areas. So the dimensions are many when we talk about inclusive growth. So we talk about the gender, it has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed now. We talk about the regions, different regions, it has to be addressed, it has to be addressed now. And we talk about previously marginalized people and all those kind of things. So that should be the answer for me, inclusive development, rather than issues where one group of society benefit while another is becoming worse off.
Okay, thank you. You know, because when I saw inclusive growth, it confused me a little bit. And I was saying to myself, how is it possible to have growth and it not be inclusive? But the way that you've really explained it, that, you know, you've got previously marginalized people, you've got youth, you've got women. So as you are growing, it's important to have policies that specifically deal and ensure that those groups are catered for. Fantastic.
Yes.
So that's inclusive growth. Okay, the next one.
Okay, so for inclusive growth to happen, and I put 5 factors or facts. Let's call them, if you were in physics, we call them, these are the laws. In other words, if you tamper with these, it will lead to this, it will lead to this. So for today's discussion, let me just call them important facts, fundamental facts. The first fundamental fact, which even policymakers needs to look at, is that it is very important. Poverty, inequality, and economic growth are linked, and this is really, really important. Which means when you address growth, you can't focus on one and leaving another. And growth is actually a result of decrease in poverty and decrease in inequality. In other words, when people are active in the economy, what happened is that they receive a wage or a profit, and then they use that money to buy more goods and services. And then once they use that money to buy more goods and services, the business people who produce more. So in other words, it's self-reinforcing. So when you include everyone, so it becomes a vicious cycle of growth, a vicious cycle of growth. So for me, which brings me to number 2, is that
sorry,
yes.
Sorry, Dr. Eddie, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to. There's a question that we've got from Rita, which I think is linked to what you're unpacking. But I also just wanted to ask, when we talk about poverty, I read in a report by Africa No Filter, the report is focusing specifically on the narrative of Africa that the media portrays. But in that report, what I want to ask is, they say that there are 13 million Africans that are in extreme poverty. So from a development economics perspective, how do you define poverty? Because in what you've just said, you've explained to us that in terms of inclusiveness and inclusive growth, people work, they earn a wage, they're able to go and buy, and then the cycle, you say, continues. So when we talk about 30 million Africans being in extreme poverty, what are we defining as poverty from the developmental economics perspective?
Okay, thank you. I think it's a very, very important question. Yes, I think to define these terms so that when we discuss them, we are all on one page. So in simple terms, when we talk of poverty, we are talking of material lack. So normally it's measured by, on average, how much money somebody has, or how much resources somebody has per given month or per given time. For example, the World Bank uses what they call a dollar per day. So in other words, they're saying if somebody is the current rate is 1.9 US dollars per day. So they're saying if somebody, a person, is earning or is able to say per day on average, I don't even have $1.90. That person is extremely poor. That's what we are talking about when we talk about poverty. So we're talking on average, somebody, and there are many, in Zimbabwe right now as we speak, around 50% of Zimbabweans are regarded as extremely poor. In other words, they don't have $1.90 per day. They're far less than that.
That's a very scary statistic. And even when you look across the continent to say that 30 million Africans are in extreme poverty, those statistics are they kind of shake your reality and kind of put things into context. Rita's asking, Dr. Eddie, how can inclusive growth be achieved if there is insufficient resources and infrastructure? So perhaps as you go along, please just bear that question in mind to address it. How can inclusive growth be achieved if there is insufficient resources and infrastructure?
Okay, I think let me try to answer it, but I will develop my points as we go. I think the issue is inclusive growth should not be looked at as a way of distributing resources from the have to the have-nots. It's not. When we talk about pro-poor policies, we are not saying let's take from the rich and let's just distribute to the poor. We are not saying that. What we are saying is that when we develop policies, we should make sure that those who are able to sell labor, they are able to sell their labor in a fair market and get a decent wage. Those who are able to sell their capital, they should be able to sell their capital in an economy which they're able to get their profit back. Those who are able to be entrepreneurs and they are selling their entrepreneurial skills, they should be able to receive their profit, just like that. So in other words, what we're talking about, we're talking about everyone being involved in building their nation. That's inclusivity. And then everyone gets a fair share of their labor. So it should be standard for me. It should be standard that people should be talking about it, because why would you want an economy which leaves other people behind? Why would you want an economy which makes other people rich, but yet others are worse off? That's exactly what the colonialists were doing unto us. They were exploiting us. So if we are now free, why should we leave others behind? So for me, that should be standard. That should be in everyone's lips. Now that we are free, now that we are deciding the fate of our nation, why can't all of us be able to be involved? And then that's it.
Right. Makes sense. We should bring and carry everyone along now that we're the masters of our own destiny.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Okay, please continue.
So the second point, which I like I first said, the first one was I said poverty, inequality, and growth are linked. But then the second point, which is also equally linked, important to this discussion, is that actually high levels of poverty and high levels of inequality actually suck growth. They hinder growth. They decrease growth. And this is exactly what is happening in South Africa today. South Africa, when they say they have chronic triple development challenges, what are they talking about? They say since independence, they've failed to reduce poverty. They have failed to reduce inequality. Inequality actually is, according to a World Bank report, South Africa actually is the most unequal society in the whole world. It holds that record.
Wow. You would never think that. You know, when you're on the outside and we're looking into South Africa, you would never think that, actually.
It's the most unequal society in the world.
We see all the unrest from a labor perspective, you know, but we don't see that view at all. That's very interesting.
So for me, those unrest you see, if you look carefully, those people who are in the streets are the poor. And it's one way of expressing that we are being left behind. It's one way, and if you look at it, poverty is too generally black. It's generally women. It's generally people from rural areas. So yes, there are still some other issues, but in my submission, issues to do with unequal access to resources always lead to instability. That's exactly what made people to go to war. It was unequal access to resources. And that's what will make Africa unstable, as long as we perpetuate the unequal access to resources. And actually, like, the danger is, once poverty continues to increase and inequality continues to increase, eventually the economy will begin to decrease. So the cake will continue to shrink, and now it's shrinking for everyone. So it's actually a bad road to take, where do you know that towards the end of apartheid, the economy was actually growing weaker and weaker? It's because the majority of that economy were out. They were just consumers. They were not involved. And that's one of the reasons why even democracy was now negotiated. Because even the Afrikaners by that time, they realized that it's not sustainable to leave the majority out. It's unfortunate that we black now on black across Africa. We are seeing the same trend. The same poor who were poor before independence are still being marginalized. And that's not good at all. So then, if I may move to the next point, the third point. So the third point, I am arguing that the growth, inequality, and poverty can never be solved by government alone. It's not possible at all. It's not possible. In other words, for real development to take place, government has to, whether they like it or not, it's no longer the problem. They have to embrace business. They have to embrace labor. And the three have to form a tripartite agreement. And together, they have to chart the course for the nation. So what we see is some bit of dictatorial tendencies where people, because they're in government, they think they know it all. They say, no, business are like this. And then it's actually self-defeating. My argument is actually self-defeating, because if business is not functioning well, the economy is not creating value. If business is not working well, it means less taxes are going to the government. If less taxes are going to the government, it means the government will not have resources to send people to school. They will not have resources to build hospitals. They will not have resources even to equip the army. So
Then
they
you
need
end up,
business to function well for them to be able to do what governments are created to do.
absolutely. And therefore, what you end up with is a small group that is overly taxed because, it's the depth of the tax base is not there. There's just a
Yes.
small tax base, and more is loaded onto that tax base.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of discussion that is happening in the group. Hi, Noreen, so good for you to join us, as well as Lorraine. And a lot of it, Dr. Eddie, I don't want to preempt you because I know that you're going to talk about politics, that you're going to talk about leadership before we close off tonight, as it's also very pivotal and is part of your manifesto. But a lot of the discussion that I'm seeing that's happening with our viewers is around leadership, and is around the aspect of the politics that is within Africa. And you were just starting to touch on that when you mentioned government and how government cannot and should not ignore business and cannot and should not ignore labor. And it's therefore then quite interesting that a lot of our first governments have come from labor. It's quite
Yes.
interesting that those that have come up and then eventually won independence for countries, etc., have come from a labor background, which kind of shows the importance of the voice of labor in any development conversation. Please continue.
Yes, I just want to extend that discussion slightly. One of the things which I argue, and this is my personal argument, that the Zimbabwe land reform did not do very well. Is exactly what we are discussing now. For real production to take place, basic economics tells you that there has to be land, and land is a very important resource. But land on its own is useless. You have to have labor, those people who work on the land. And you have to have capital so that you can be able to invest in machinery which are needed to work on the land. You also have to have even entrepreneurship. So to be able to decide which crop to do and where to get the market is entrepreneurship. And there has to be even technology. So what we find is that if people focus too much on land, and even as in the politics, people say land is the economy and the economy is land. For me, it's not true. It's not true. If you have land without labor, nothing happens. If you have land without capital, nothing happens. If you have land without entrepreneurship, idea on how to do with the land, nothing happens. That's why right now people are leaving land, so to speak, and they're going to foreign nations because they are there on the land. The only thing they can do is to die on their land and then be buried there because they don't have capital, they don't have entrepreneurship, they don't have even the labor to work on the land. So the economy is built on a combination of factors of production, not one.
Very insightful. Land on its own without labor, dololo, right? Because nothing can happen. Land is not productive on its own. It needs a man to make it produce. And that's essentially what you're saying, and that tripartite that you were talking about. So you were unpacking for us, Dr. Eddie, that both business and government need to jointly address development on the continent. It's not a one-man show. So you can, let's continue with that conversation.
Yes, and the most important link between the government this side and business this side for jointly lift people out of poverty, out of inequality, is employment. That's the most important link. That's why America, they are so focused on unemployment because they know that once the economy is producing jobs, it means that economy is reducing poverty. That economy is reducing inequality. Because the real creators of jobs are the business, like I indicated. Yes, the government can still be able to recruit, but it's a very small margin. It's a very small number. So real jobs happen in big businesses, in small businesses, outside government cycles. So if you really want to address unemployment, you have to talk to business, number one. But once unemployment is addressed, you are at the core of lifting people from poverty. You are at the core of lifting people from marginalization. They are self-worthy. You know, when people are not working, they're not. They don't even have confidence. They're just roaming around. So people have meaning if they're able to earn their own salary. I know some people will say, "Oh yes, I think we need to make sure that we create more opportunities for business." It's the same. It's the same. The same person who can be able to create a business can soon be able to grow another man's business and it grows. So, in other words, an economy should be in such a way that those who want to work should work. Those who want to start business should start. And whether you are saying, I'm starting a business, I'm selling my entrepreneurial skills, you should get your profit. If you are saying, I'm just want to work, I want to sell my labor, I should get my decent wage. So both are good for development. And so now when we talk about employment,
use your fingerprints to unlock the device.
When we talk about unemployment, my apologies, when we talk about employment, we then come to something which is really, really at the core of my heart, at the bottom of my heart, inclusive education. Inclusive education. I want to argue through this platform that right now as we speak, South Africa is actually doing what I will call today education apartheid. I'm using examples.
That's very bold. That is very bold.
Education apartheid, the same thing in Zim, and I will explain. It's different phenomenon, but it's the same. It's education apartheid. I will explain in South Africa first, then I'll go to Zimbabwe. I'm just using those two as examples. For example, if you go to a rural area in South Africa, if you go to a township in South Africa, the teacher boldly teaches the kids, if you get 30%, you're okay, it's a pass. If you get 40%, it's a pass, so you're okay. But if you go to Sandton and other private schools, the teacher will tell the kid, if you got 70%, that's good. So if you find the poor have a lower bar and they go to an under-resourced school and they come out with below par results. The rich send their kids to private schools, well-equipped schools, and their kids come up with the flying colors. So what are we doing? We are creating inequality at school. The moment somebody starts ECD, we are already saying if your father or mother are poor, you remain poor. If your father and mother are rich, you have a better chance of making it. So people will then later say, oh, why is it that inequality is not being solved? We are creating it every day by making sure that we have a boundary. They have nots and those without. And then we give them two different education systems. So even when they go to a workplace, the other one does not know how to do it because they were not given good quality education. The same way the colonial government was giving blacks bad education. We are perpetuating it.
So are you saying for a fact that a rural school in South Africa has different grading systems to a private school? I mean, isn't that something that is governed by like the Ministry of Education? How can one say 30% is a pass when, like, is that what the Ministry of Education says, or is that something that's just come about because it's not policed, it's not well audited or governed? Because that's very scary.
No, it's a government policy.
Oh, wow.
That's
even more scary.
It's a government policy. But what then happens is, are the standards being put in those schools? So some schools will say, we won't accept it. So we strive for 70%. Some will say, no, even if you get 40%, it's fine. But it's government policy that 40% is a pass. And I'm saying that's the problem.
Wow. That is a real problem, Dr.
Yeah.
Eddie, a
So
real
then we come to
problem.
Zimbabwe briefly. It's the same in Zimbabwe. It's not, we have the same pass rate, which is 51% and above, 50% and above. But you find that the rich, whether they are in opposition or otherwise, is the same. They send their students, their children to private schools. They do Cambridge, and Cambridge can help them to access global opportunities. And others are saying ZEC is enough. Sorry, I'm now saying ZEC. ZIMSEC is enough.
Yeah.
They're told ZIMSEC is enough. And the ZIMSEC is not well funded. And ZIMSEC has challenges to do with the exams. Sometimes papers are leaked and so forth. So it decreases the value of an education system. But those who are in power, they don't mind, because they can send their kids to America, they can send their kids to UK. So before you know it, the kids of the rich are always going to be the managers, and the kids of the poor will always become the general workers. And I'm saying that's apartheid. That's exactly apartheid.
And we're doing it to ourselves.
Apartheid was separating by the skin color. Now the separator is income and political affiliation.
Sure. So what should be done? Because I'm not necessarily, I see definitely that Cambridge, we grew up being told Cambridge is the better one. But I believe that we should build our own ZIMSEC to be at the same level, not necessarily always look outwards in terms of solutions. So what do we need to do to ensure that ZIMSEC is enough, to ensure that each African country will have their own local exam boards and examination systems, curriculums. What needs to be done to ensure that our curriculums that we develop that are appropriate to our continent or to ours are the ones that are actually appropriate, because we cannot always be looking outward for a solution or for a standard. Surely.
Excellent question. For me, that's the solution. We should develop our own, and we should value our own. The first step, let's all use our own. That's the first step. If we all use our own, that's the first step. Because what is the incentive of me developing a good school, yet my child is not part of it? What is the need of me developing a hospital when I'm not using it? What is the need of me having good drinking water if I'm not using it? So the first step is, as leaders, let's have confidence in the institution we preside over and use them. And if they are not working, let's fix them. Rather than this of saying, this one is just for the poor. But these are the same poor you are saying I'm presiding over, and they voted me democratically. So my point, let's fix them together. So that there is an incentive for even the budget to look into these issues, because it affects all of us.
Absolutely. I would love to dwell more into that, but I know that you've got something else, just one more point talking about the politics and how that is, a driver of inclusive growth, inclusive development, and pro-poor policies. So maybe we can get into that. I would have loved to just be able to double click. Maybe we have to get you back so we can double click on education and how all our leaders, and it's not something that's peculiar to Zimbabwe and South Africa, I must hasten to say. If you look across our continent, all those who have, or we perceive to be have, will always take their children outside the continent, to America, to the UK, to all those other places, but instead of actually being the ones leading from the front and taking their children to places that are within their borders.
Yeah. So my last point, and then we will then develop the arguments, is that I think all of them are important, but this one I want to give it more importance. I think it's a very, very important point to understand that development is derived from politics. This is really key. Do you know that where our church was determined by a politician? Whether we open church or we don't, it's politics. Whether we have water or we don't, it's politics. Whether we actually have a creche, early childhood development center close to us, it's politics. Whether we actually have water at our school, it's politics. So what am I saying? The real driver of development is politics. That's why it's important for politicians to be assessed on how they have developed the nation. So it has to be, when you entered into government, what was the level of inflation? Where is it now? When you entered into government, what was the employment rate? Where is it now? When you entered into government, how many people were poor? How many are there now? When you entered into government, how many people were regarded as what? Poor or marginalized? Where is it now? So that's why it's so important. Some people say, no, we are becoming too political. I'm saying to survive a normal life, you need a road, and that road is determined by a politician. Politicians decide whether to have a road or not. For you to survive a normal life, to have a clinic, it's politicians who decide to say there should be a clinic or not. So what I'm saying is politics matters for development. It matters. Therefore, it's important to have politicians who are accountable, and it matters to have politicians who can be made accountable by votes. That's why I spoke about a democratic developmental state. It's important for people to know, or people to be able to have the confidence to recall a politician if the politician has not developed the area. And to be able to put people who can have their interests at heart. And that's why sometimes in Africa we have a challenge of people who are maybe in power, and then maybe they are supported by the army, or they are supported by a clique and so forth. It is anti-development. People don't know it, but it is anti-development. Because once you are saying this person should not be accountable to the people, you are saying this person, even if they don't deliver, they are assured of being in power. So they don't have an incentive to develop, because they cannot be recalled, they cannot be removed. So if I know that come rain, come sunshine, I'll still be in power. So I can even sleep. I can do nothing. Because I know that I'm guaranteed to be there. So democracy is supposed to help develop nations by removing those who are not doing well and replace with those who are doing well. And then what happens if the person who you put in is not doing well? You remove again. So that is where the incentive for development comes from. It comes from the ability to be made accountable. Yeah.
So Dr. Eddie, what is then missing from an African leadership perspective and accountability? Over the last, 4 or 5 months, it's been going on. I just want to welcome Rita Wano, who is joining us from the UK, where where the Prime Minister and his team have been hauled before Parliament. Vote of no confidence is being threatened around having a party at Downing Street when it was complete lockdown. So what I find is there is accountability when we look in the developed countries. What gap, or how do we close the gap in terms of making politicians accountable on the continent? Is it a journey to get to accountability? Again, linking back to perhaps the fact that our democracies on the continent are still much younger than democracies in developed countries. what is that gap? Why do we have such a lack of accountability? Why are we, the electorate, not holding our leaders to account?
I would say it's a journey, yes, but that journey can be made shorter if people really are willing to develop. I'll cite some examples. We have seen in Botswana, they changed their leaders, their economy is stable and is growing. We look at Mauritius, we look at even South Africa. Yes, it still has some challenges, but so in other words, we still need more African nations which actually embrace the concept that democracy is good for development. I think we still have that mentality in some where people think democracy is fostered on us, and then the question will be, what is the option? I don't seem to see an option to democracy because you should be accountable to the people, and the better idea should carry the day. If you are not able to do it, why can't I allow another person to do it?
So if you're saying that there is a possibility that it could be a journey, what would you say are maybe step one, maybe the first two steps we should take to get us on that road to accountability?
There are two things. Firstly, when one reads the African Union reports, there are very, very good standards. Even these issues of democratic developmental states, they are very good standards. When you look at institutions like SADC, for example, they have protocols and guidelines on how to run a democratic election. They do have. What I think we might have dropped the ball along the way is the generation of the Thabo Mbekis, where there was a clear discussion at that level, where people would say, let's have peer review. To say to President so and so, I think what you are doing is wrong. I think the solution is peer review. So
Do you
I think
think our leaders are ready? Sorry, Dr. Eddie, do you think our leaders are ready for peer reviews? I don't even think our corporate leaders are ready for 360-degree review sessions. And you think our politicians are ready to sit around and be told, you, my friend, are not doing a good job here?
I'm saying we dropped the ball. The generation of Thabo Mbeki, President Thabo Mbeki, the generation of President Obasanjo, that kind of generation of Mohau of Botswana, they actually initiated this. And for me, it should have been taken, continued. But maybe there was a dropping of the ball. But most importantly, if leaders are not ready, they will be made ready by the people. So what I'm saying is, if people demand freedom now, it might take 5 years to maybe oppress them. It might take even 10 years. Sometimes it might take even 30, but it's not sustainable. That's what I'm arguing. This generation of young people will not actually allow for their freedom to be taken away. They will not actually allow for them to remain in perpetual poverty. They will not allow it. Yeah.
I 100% agree with you. Dr. Eddie, I can't even believe that time has gone as fast as it has. This discussion has been exciting and is becoming more and more exciting as we've gone on. There's been so much conversation in our chat box. Trust says Dr. Eddie should be given a platform to address the AU summit. Maybe our leaders can learn from him and make good policies for inclusive growth and development in Africa. Chiedza Kayende is absolutely blown away by the term educational apartheid. And Rita says, educational apartheid is worldwide. It's not just in developing countries, but it's something that's also in developed countries. It's been a fantastic discussion. Just to wind down, Dr. Eddie, in a minute, just one last thing that you feel that our audience, that Africa should know. What would you like to say to us in closing?
So what I want to say is that when our fathers, our grandfathers went to war, they definitely went to war because they were excluded in the resource allocation of their nations. They were excluded in the management of their economies. They were excluded in economic opportunities. So the same thing cannot continue. We actually need to say, now that we have our own countries, let's develop these countries together. Let's not leave anyone behind. Let's embrace inclusive growth. Let's embrace inclusive development. It actually makes good economics to involve everyone, because at the end of the day, it makes the economy grow faster, and even the leaders will have their pensions guaranteed. You can't have a pension in an economy which is going down. So
Absolutely.
it's for everyone's benefit.
Absolutely. Dr. Eddie, thank you so very much. I have really enjoyed having this discussion with you. Dr. Eddie was sharing with us his African dream, his economic thoughts, his own manifesto on how to develop Africa. Let no one be left behind. Inclusive growth, inclusive development, pro-poor policies. That is one man's African dream. What is your African dream? Let's continue the conversation. If you want to get in touch with Dr. Eddie, he is on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram at Eddie Mahembe. Get in touch, inbox him. I know he's keen to continue the conversation. We at Tando are also very keen to continue the conversation. What is your African dream? Today on the 26th of May, a day after the globe has celebrated Africa Day. What's your African dream? Thank you so much for joining us. This is Sapi signing out from a closer perspective on behalf of Tanda Channel. Whatever you're doing, please be safe. Have a good evening, Africa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Eddie. Goodbye.